Welcome to Common Space, a conversation amongst three friends who happen to be United Methodist pastors. My name's Chris Estes.
Hi, Chris. I'm Daryl.
Hi, Daryl.
Hi, Chris. I'm Ryan.
Hi, Ryan. Today on Common Space, we're stepping into one of the Bible's deepest, strangest, and most emotionally honest books, the Book of Job. But instead of approaching Job as a courtroom transcript of literal history, we're going to explore it as ancient wisdom literature, a meditation on suffering, faith, anger, mystery, and what it means to stay in relationship with God when life falls apart. So, Ryan, why don't you give us a summary of the Book of Job in 6 words?
6 words. Let's go with...
That's like 7 or 8 words. You're already off the page.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm glad you're counting. We'll go with counsel, accusation, disaster, suffering, trial. For word number 6, I'm going to go with ambiguous conclusion. So how about 7 words?
I'm going to go with in the kitchen, throwing dishes at God. That's 7 words. I missed. Kitchen side, throwing dishes at God.
Kitchen scene, throwing dishes at God.
That was a great summary, Ryan.
Not me?
And Daryl,
Thank you.
why don't you tell us a little bit more about the story?
So for being such a long book, it's a rather kind of simple structure to it. There's a prologue, a very extensive set of poems, and then there's an epilogue. The prologue is this introduction where God is in God's divine counsel and just kind of making the declaration that everything's working according to the way that it needs to work. And a character who is called the accuser, we often translate it as the proper name Satan, but that's not a good translation. It should be a translation of the accuser because it's more of a title than a name. Ha-Satan, Ha means the, Satan means accuser. And so the accuser, the prosecutor, comes to God and is doing the job that this prosecutor or accuser has been created to do and says, you say everything's working the way it's supposed to be, but I think, especially in the case of this character Job, that the only reason that this guy is so faithful and righteous is basically because you've rewarded him. He doesn't have any kind of thing going against him. And when the world is easy, it's really easy to praise you. And so I bet if you messed with him, things would probably turn around. And so God basically gives Satan, this Satan character, the accuser, the authority to go and mess with Job. And the Satan does. And the Satan takes a lot of things away from Job, including riches, including homes, including children, including health. And the only thing that Job is left with is a wife who basically tells him to go kill himself. And so
she's not a happy wife.
No. And so that's the prologue. And the bulk of the book is a set of poetry in which Job essentially puts God on trial, saying, if this is a just universe and you are a just God, then something is going wrong here. And I cannot believe that you would create a universe that's not just. So I'm going to go ahead and say you are acting unjustly towards me. And the poetry is this, it begins with Job kind of lamenting, and he curses the day he was born and wishes he would never have come into existence. And then his friends come and they sit with him for a little while, and then a conversation begins, and we get almost 40 chapters. It's like 36, 37 chapters of poetic conversation between Job and his 3 friends. And then there's a 4th friend that kind of pops up towards the end that's an interesting little character. In these conversations, simply understood, Job is saying, I have done nothing wrong, and yet I suffer, and it is God's fault. And the friends keep saying, you must have done something wrong. If this is happening to you in this universe, in this way that the world works, and the way that we know our God works, then you must have done something wrong. That's why you're suffering. And Job maintains his innocence throughout. And finally, towards the end of it, Job is confronted by the God character itself, and it's an interesting conversation there. And then the epilogue is that everything that was taken from Job is returned to him multiplied. And, they all live happily ever after.
Daryl, this setup feels theatrical. A wager in heaven, the adversary. What was the writer trying to accomplish here with this kind of framing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're being invited into the story. I think that's what they were trying to accomplish. It's helpful to see this as like ancient wisdom theater, something that would have been acted out around a campfire or something like that, where people are seeing this acted out. Because the first invitation the Satan character brings to God is to say, the only reason that Job is good is because you've given him all these blessings, which is an invitation for me to say, okay, am I following my faith? Am I living a life of faith because of the good stuff? And what if the good stuff is removed? Because that's what happens next, is the good stuff is removed. The blessings are removed. Then when that doesn't break Job's relationship with God, the Satan character asks another question, says, okay, well, he's only staying in relationship with you because he's afraid of you. He's afraid of having your protection removed. And so that's another invitation in, like, am I only in this because I'm either afraid of God, or am I only in this because I want the good things? And both of those kind of position God as a distant character. And Job is tempted to stand apart from God and ask these questions of like, why, which are tough to answer because at its root, this is about suffering. I think we can all relate to that. So a bit of ancient wisdom literature that invites you to consider suffering, why bad things happen to good people, is an invitation to which we can all relate.
Daryl, let's go back to the God and the Satan character, or the adversary character again. What are we supposed to do with this Hasatana character?
It's a troubling thing for a lot of people who have been raised in a dualistic tradition to say, you know, God is the good God and Satan is the bad God, because this ancient story does not position it that way. This ancient story positions the accuser as working for God, working with God, under, however you want to say that, under the control of God. And so this is one of the strange disconnected points about this character Satan that we find in the biblical library. And we want to believe that there's a continuing narrative that runs throughout the Bible that says consistent things about the Satan character, but it's just not the case. The character pops up in different ways and in different roles throughout the biblical library because the books were written by different people in different places and different times with different understandings. So there's just not a consistent thread. But what we can say unequivocally is that in no place in the biblical library is the Satan character God's counterpart or God's opposite. That is dualism. That is separating God into two deities, and that is not the Judeo-Christian tradition. We have a non-dualistic tradition and a non-dualistic library that says, yeah, there's no opposite to God. There's no counter to God.
Ryan, do you see this book as explaining why good people suffer?
I think that we can learn a little bit about that question from this book, but I don't think that that's what this book is really about. This is certainly a narrative in which a good and righteous character suffers for no apparent reason. And towards the end, God even says as much. Like, he admonishes Job's friends and says, you guys have not spoken rightly about me, while Job has. And if you read some of the things that Job has said about God, you might be rather shocked when God says Job has spoken rightly, because Job has thrown around things like God is unjust, God likes to torture human beings for pleasure. Like, there's a whole lot of weird stuff that Job throws God's direction. And this doesn't make him unrighteous, but this makes him a very in-character type of person for the Hebrew scriptures and for who the Hebrew people are as they wrestle with the divine. Remember back to the story of Jacob wrestling with the divine. Like, this is who the people of God are supposed to be, is people that wrestle with God. And so Job is very much wrestling with God. So while you can glean some of the insight and maybe some wisdom about this question of why humans suffer, and particularly why do good people suffer, I think the bigger question that this book is asking is, how does the world work that God created? And even more than that, how does this God work?
So to look at this through a traditional lens would require us to buy into the idea of a transactional relationship with God, wouldn't it?
Either a transactional relationship with God or a transactional relationship with the world. And so Job is kind of a response to some other writings in the Bible. You may have heard that Job is one of the earliest pieces of writing in the Bible. And the reason that people say it's the earliest piece of writing in the Bible is because they heard somebody else say it. There's not really any grounds for actually believing that. The language, the Hebrew language that's used in this book is really refined. Like, it looks like it's late language after this Hebrew language has been developed for centuries. And it also deals with themes and uses phrases that come from other places in the scriptures. And so Job very much is a narrative that's been written and a poem that's been written in response to some of the other things that are in the Bible. In particular, Deuteronomy, especially the last parts of Deuteronomy, and then the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So Job comes as kind of our third piece of wisdom literature. And the book of Proverbs is a book that basically tells us, if you do this, then this will happen. This is the way you should behave. And if you behave in this manner and this manner is called wisdom. If you behave with wisdom, then basically you'll do okay. And those that don't listen to this wisdom and don't live in this manner are going to suffer. So Proverbs is pretty conventional literature. It's pretty conventional wisdom. Like it says, if you don't lie, then things will be okay. If you're an honest person, then people are going to be honest with you. And if you don't cheat in business, then people aren't going to cheat you in business. And if you handle a foolish person in the right ways, you might actually correct them and things like that. But what Ecclesiastes then comes and says is, sometimes that just doesn't happen. Conventional wisdom doesn't always prevail. Sometimes good people die, and sometimes there's chance in the world. And you know what? Sometimes it's really hard to find meaning with anything that we're handling. And so Ecclesiastes kind of challenges this wisdom of Proverbs. And then Job comes along and kind of takes issue with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes to say that, to presume that you might understand any of it is a rather egotistical position for you to be in. And it's kind of similar with the Proverbs and Deuteronomy are very similar. I mentioned Deuteronomy, but Deuteronomy towards the end of it kind of says, if you do this, then good things, God will bless you. And if you don't do this, then God's going to curse you.
Yeah, Ryan's given us a very helpful word there, right? When he talks about conventional wisdom and sets up Job as post-conventional wisdom, which is again pointing back to that invitation in, because I think we can probably all relate to having these times in our lives where it just doesn't make sense. The transaction's not working. I did everything right and everything still went to crap. That there's times when the pithy bumper sticker billboard wisdom does not define or explain what's going on in my life. And here's the problem of Job. This doesn't explain it either. Job doesn't get the answer he's looking for. He's not given answers to the questions or accusations that he makes against God, but basically comes out with this wisdom that says this life, this reality contains both the blessing and the stripping away. Both are held within the same source, within the same God. At the end, when God shows up as a whirlwind and gives the speech to Job, he doesn't answer the question. He doesn't answer Job's question. He responds with more questions, and God's questions are even scarier and more wild than Job's questions. So these divine rhetorical questions that God asks at the end, they're not the answer for Job as to why all this happened. They're an invitation to a much larger space than Job's original question occupied. He's invited into that space of holding on to all of it. Suffering and blessing are part of the same reality. They're part of the same God. And it's not always going to make sense, which is essentially Job's main accusation against God, right? When Job pops off finally, he basically says of God, you're not acting like God. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. And God's answer is, you're right. Not my bad, not I'm sorry, not here's why. God just says, you're right. And that is tough to hold on to, especially for our Western minds that are very used to everything being resolved in a 22-minute sitcom or a 47-minute episode of SVU.
The book doesn't give us simplistic answers about suffering and really rejects the idea, this transactional idea, really, that every tragedy is a direct result of God.
Again, I think it's bigger than just even the suffering part of it. It's really a question about how the world works. The Bible Project folks really helped me understand it. They talked about there being this triangle of concepts that we know to be true or we think to be true. Like one of those concepts is that God is just. If God is a just God, then you know that God is going to give people what they deserve, basically. Another principle of this book is the assumption that the world works on kind of a similar setup. Like God set up a universe in which people get compensated for their actions in an appropriate manner. And so there's two assumptions about justice. God is just, and God created a world that is just. And then the other thing that we know to be true is that Job is innocent. We learn that in the prologue. We know that Job is innocent. We know that Job is considered righteous, and Job does absolutely nothing that would deserve this sort of retribution from God or from a Satan character. So the question is, how can all three of these things be true at the same time? And so Job takes issue with God's justice. Like Job starts making the accusations, like Daryl said, you're not acting like God. because God is supposed to be just. Where the friends come in is that they don't think, they're like, well, God is obviously just and God created a just world. So Job, there's no way that you're innocent. And so they take issue with that one. And that final response from God is that, you know what, all three of these things are true. And, this 2 chapters of, can you understand this? Have you witnessed this? Do you know how to wrangle this? Like, it's 2 chapters of amazing poetry about the power and the wisdom of God in creation and overcoming chaos and all these kinds of things. And what he's basically saying is that, you know what, all 3 of these things can be true, and perhaps you just don't understand it. And so the very end of this scene before Job gets to the epilogue is that Job says something along the lines of, I recant and I repent of dust and ash. And it is one of the hardest phrases in Hebrew, in our Hebrew text, to translate. There's like 4 or 5 different possibilities of what this sentence might be saying. But most of them it's not a repentance that Job says, oh yeah, you're right, I'm not righteous. It's a repentance of, you know what, perhaps I shouldn't have challenged something that I didn't understand, and I need to sit down in humility and remain here.
All right, guys, we've talked a lot about the structure of the story and got into some of the nitty-gritty. What intrigues you about this story, Daryl?
Yeah, there is a troubling, often overlooked detail when Job's friends show up in the story that it just bothers me all to pieces. And that is when Job is hit with all these tragedies, when all these blessings are removed, it says that his friends show up, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, show up to see Job. And it says that when they show up, they lift up their voices and weep with him. They tear their robes, they throw dust on their heads, and then they sit with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights in silence, which is actually where the Hebraic practice of sitting Shiva comes from. Is a remez, is a connection to this story. I don't do that, and it bothers me. When people that I care about have bad things happening in their life, when they're suffering, when they're in pain, I do not show up and sit silently with them for a week. I mean, it is a stretch if I can show up and be silent for a minute. So there's a challenge there. I know that the friends are going to ultimately start talking and screwing things up. And that I can relate to because I do show up, start talking and screw things up. But before they
you do.
Yeah, right. Preach. There's a whole podcast dedicated to it. What I can't relate to, what is so challenging, is the question of the next time someone I love, someone I care about is suffering. Can I show up and just be with them and not try to fix them, not try to explain their suffering or their trials, not try to make it better? Can I just show up and be with them? The answer is troubling. I don't like what I see when I look in that mirror.
Can you just hold space, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And these guys get a really bad rap for everything they say after that. But I want them to get credit for the fact that for the first week, they crushed it. And I've never done that in my life. I've never done this. So I want that dichotomy fascinates me.
One of the 12-step fellowships I'm in, well, I'll name it, Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. It's in our format, and it's a regular practice in our crosstalk statement where we don't respond to what another person's sharing, either verbally or rolling our eyes or anything else. And if a person's having an emotional moment, we don't do anything to comfort them either. We don't try to explain away their emotion because people need to have their moment. What we do is we hold space and we're there for them. And if they want some help, they can ask. But it's such an important concept. And that's what these guys do right, for 7 days. That's when they were most faithful. Is their presence before explanation, silence before theology.
Yeah, for a week. No explanations, no theology, no God has a plan, or the Lord works in mysterious ways. None of that.
Right. Witness before advice. Perhaps we could learn a lesson. Ryan, earlier you talked about Jacob wrestling with God, and that to be a faithful Israelite meant to do just that, to wrestle with God. So this story declares you can be angry at God and still be in relationship with God. Say more about that if you would.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I love about the Job character in this is that Job maintains his own integrity throughout the entire narrative. Like even in the sense of declaring his own innocence, like I feel like if I had gone through all of the things that Job had gone through, and then am sitting with my friends, Daryl and Chris come and try to convince me that I must have done something wrong.
Well, you did.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I'm your friend.
well, of course you are. You are my friend and colleague. But I feel like I would start questioning myself. I'm the type of person that, as an Enneagram 4, feels deep shame about myself, even when there's nothing to
He's actually a 5.
have. The Enneagram is a mirror, not a lens, Chris.
Speaking of shame.
Yeah. So as an Enneagram 4, I feel deep shame about who I am often when I'm at my low points, even when there's nothing to feel shame about. And so unlike Joe, I don't think I would maintain the integrity that he has in maintaining the position that he's in. And then even when Job gets his chance, like throughout this whole story, it's an argument with his friends. And it's kind of like, it is almost like one of those courtroom dramas where he and his friends are set up as lawyers arguing opposing sides of a case. I mean, that's how the whole story starts, with God and his divine counsel and a prosecutor coming in and making an argument. And so when Job finally, at the end of these different courtroom dramas, gets to maintain his case before God, he still does. He doesn't back down. And he does not just capitulate to who God is. He does not grovel. He does not back down because of the presence of the powerful. He stands up and he says what he needs to say.
Yeah.
And I love that he actually does that. And then God honors him with a response. And it's not like an easy response. And God doesn't just say, you're wrong about this and we'll move on. And God doesn't say, you're right about this and we'll move on. God gives like an elaborate, brilliant poem about the majesty, about the amazing things that this God is capable of. And it's at the end of it, Job doesn't then back down and say, you're right, I'm done, and walk away. But Job sits in the dust and ash that he's been sitting in throughout the entire narrative and says, I'm still here.
What Ryan's bringing out is the instructional part of the relationship for me when things aren't going well. Because perhaps the most spiritually radical thing about Job is that he's ticked off. As Ryan just told us, he's furious. Job curses the day he was born. He accuses God of being bully, of hunting him down and being absent. And as Ryan just said, Job basically takes God to court and demands a hearing. And that's not a man accepting his suffering quietly with a smile. But here's the thing. He never walks out. Job never says there is no God. Job never says, I'm done with this relationship. He stays in it. He keeps addressing God directly, even when what he's saying sounds like heresy. And so the wisdom of Job ultimately declares that you can be angry at God and still be in relationship with God. The rabbis talk about it as you may be throwing dishes at God, but you stay in the kitchen. Right? In fact, Job's anger is the proof of the relationship, because we don't rage against someone who's not there. We don't rage against a deity in whom we don't believe, and we don't file a lawsuit against the universe, right? This is the posture of Job that, I'm ticked off. I got a bone to pick, but I'm not going to break relationship. I'm going to stay in it and then throw the dishes that I need to throw. Brian, I've heard you tell another story, I think from Ellie Wiesel, about a beautiful metaphorical story that kind of occupies this same space. Will you tell that story?
So there is a really cool story. Ellie Wiesel wrote a play about it, and then a little bit later, somebody wrote a movie about it. And the last time I watched the movie, it was actually on YouTube. So if you want to find this movie, it's called God on Trial. Search that on YouTube, and it might still be on there. But it is a movie that takes place in one of the concentration camps during the Holocaust. And there is this barracks that is home to, 40 or 50 Jewish men who are in the work camp and enslaved to the Germans, and every day watch more and more of their brothers and sisters and wives and children going into gas chambers. And in this barracks at night, when they all come into town, they essentially set up a rabbinical court in the barracks, and they put God on trial. And there is a rabbi that in the story that argues his position, and there are other people that argue their position, but basically they're asking the same kind of question: is God just? Is God good? Because if our God is just and if our God is good, and if the world works in such a way that we receive the compensation that we deserve, then something is going wrong here. And it is a brilliant movie in which they keep arguing back and forth, back and forth. And one of the final scenes is this rabbi that's kind of shouting out, coming to the conclusion. It's a moment of despair in which he is absolutely giving up everything that he thinks he ever knew. And he starts shouting out, God is not good, or God is not just, and like almost working against everything that he said throughout the movie. It's amazing. And then at the end, it is time for prayers. And so even after this very moment in which they come to the conclusion that God is not acting as God should be acting, they decide that it is time for the evening prayers, and they go out to their evening prayer, and it's time for them to worship, and it's time for them to praise, and it's time for them to pray to this God that they've just declared unjust.
That reminds me of the N.T. Wright quote that you guys heard in person, actually. Wherever this goes, I am with you. God says that to us, and we say that to God. Wherever this goes, I'm with you. And maybe the wisdom of Job isn't about suffering being explained. Rather, it's about learning how to be present and honest with God, with ourselves, and with each other in the middle of it.
Beautiful.
So what are y'all's parting thoughts?
I think that the book of Job gives us a voice among a collection of voices that are trying to explain and explicate our sense that there is a divine, and that we are trying to figure out who this divine is. And it's really easy to get lost and confused, and even to the point where we can argue with our own scriptures about how the world works and how God sets these things up. And so Job, I think, is just a voice of honesty and a voice of integrity, and a voice that says the world is actually complicated. And if we reduce it down to simple systems of right and wrong and behavior that's met with certain consequences, that we're going to be confounded over and over again. And we need to be more honest with ourselves and with the way that the world works.
Yeah, I love all of that. I definitely love that we're holding post-conventional wisdom and not like little small ideas, because that's just not what this story is about. I'm struck that at the very end, as we've talked about in the Whirlwind speech, and Ryan brought this out, that God turns to the friends of Job and says, I'm angry with you and because of what y'all have spoken about me. It's not right. But what my servant Job has spoken about me is right. And as Ryan pointed out, Job just rails against God. So for God to say Job spoke rightly, Job, the guy that accused God of cruelty and demanded God show up and answer for God's self, that speaking rightly is fascinating. This story carries with it an implicit acknowledgement that what happened to Job is not okay, because at the end of the story, Job kind of gets some stuff back. Now, I don't want to make this seem too sweet. Job lost children, and he doesn't get the children he lost back. He gets new children. So that's not like everything is restored. This is not a happy ending. This is kind of like the court has found in your favor and there will be some restitution, but you can't be made whole. We're not going to make you whole from what you have lost. The problem doesn't get resolved. God doesn't explain God's self or God's actions. The problem actually gets deepened, and the book of Job refuses any easy answer. So I think what I would encourage to be a main takeaway is anybody that comes at you with easy bumper sticker answers or easy stitch it on a pillow wisdom from Job, they need to read it again, because that's not what's going on here. The question doesn't get answered. It doesn't say if suffering's always deserved or if everything will be made whole. It just leaves us with a question in a space that's large enough for the God that we have. I mean, and as Ryan pointed out earlier, the humility that, sometimes we might just need to be still and be quiet, and let God be bigger than the God of our understanding.
A God who's less of a micromanager and more of a deeply present source, moving with creation, mystery, beauty, danger, and pain. Any recommendations, fellas?
Yeah, I recommend a book by a scholar named Gustavo Gutiérrez. And while I say he's a scholar, the book is very approachable. It's called On Job, God Talk and the Suffering of the Innocent. Gustavo Gutiérrez was a liberationist theologian, and so he deals a lot with suffering, particularly with people that are poor. In his situation, people in Central America that are suffering. And so he writes this book on Job that talks about Job not as a book that is trying to explain suffering. Like it's not an attempt to answer the problem of evil, which I'm surprised we didn't even talk about in this podcast. But it's not a book that's trying to answer the problem of evil. It's a book that's trying to encourage people to maintain their relationship with God even through suffering, which is something that we've been talking about in this podcast.
I'm going to say The Wisdom Pattern, Order, Disorder, Reorder by Richard Rohr.
Yeah, I don't have a specific recommendation. I would just point you toward Elie Wiesel. You can read Night, you can read Putting God on Trial, or check out the movie that Ryan talked about. I think Wiesel occupies the post-Holocaust tension of what do we do with suffering in this God of our understanding, and leaves it in the same big spaces that the book of Job does. So check out Elie Wiesel.
Well, fellas, it's been lovely. And until next time, may your eyes be filled with wonders, your heart full of joy, your footsteps firm as you walk with God, and let your light become your voice. See you next time.
Peace.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Common Space. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to this show so you don't miss a single episode. If you have a faith-related question you'd like to submit to the show for the chance of it being featured on a future episode, visit ahumc.org/questions to submit. That's ahumc.org/QUESTIONS. If you'd like to contact the podcast team, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.